Okay, so welcome everyone, and we have a few people online. So welcome back to our RSO 75 years anniversary seminar series. Some of you might not have attended the previous seminars, but this seminar series is running in conjunction with the 75-year anniversary of the Rural Sociology Group at Wageningen, and this is leading up to a celebratory event in May. And throughout last year and then now into this year, we've had a series of speakers, people that we engage with in our work that we find inspiring, that we've invited to come and talk to us and help us think about the next 75 years of rural sociology at Wageningen. So we're very excited that this is actually our first in-person seminar that we've been able to hold in this series. And yeah, we still have some people joining us online as well. So thanks for being here. I won't say too much more. I'm very excited that Michael is here and could join us in person. But I'm going to hand over to Han now, who's going to host the rest of this session and introduce Michael. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Those online, we'd like you to participate in the Q&A session after Michael's talk as well. You can just leave questions in the chat, and then we can get to those questions as well. So yeah, Mike will talk for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A after that, and we'll finish up at 1:30. So over to you, Han.
Okay. I think I first need to be sort of in the picture. Yeah. Okay, welcome, welcome everyone. I think the camera is following you, Mike.
It's following me, not you. He knows where to look.
You're more important.
I'm so used to that. You can be in the picture.
So yeah, we sort of have to stand next to one another to be visible online. Anyway, Mike, first of all, thanks very much for accepting the invitation to speak, and we're very glad that it's also possible to do this, as Mark was also saying, as an in-person event, which is. I think after having been mainly online for 2 years, it's actually nice to see people and sort of have this in an in-person setting. And maybe for the audience over here and also online, maybe a couple of introductory words about you, which I simply also took from your CV on the website of Aberystwyth University. But you've been Professor of Human Geography at Aberystwyth University. It's taken me years to pronounce that name, but actually it's quite easy once you know how to pronounce it. In Wales, the United Kingdom, since 2008, and from 2007 to 2013 you were also director of the Institute of Geography and Earth Sciences, one of the institutes also at Aberystwyth University. And in 2014 till 2018 you also had a 4-year post as Professor of Transformative Social Science, where you were also responsible for building capacity in social science research across the university. Your research interests mainly focus on rural geography, political geography, and you have been director, co-director of quite a few centers and institutes. Just to name a few: the Centre for Welsh Politics and Society, which is an interdisciplinary research center bringing together geographers, political scientists, historians, and other researchers. There is the Aberystwyth or the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research, Data and Methods, WISER, of which you're a co-director. And you have also been co-director of the Welsh Rural Observatory, which was a collaborative center with Cardiff University and funded by the Welsh government, which mainly focused on supporting rural development research. On top of that, you have also been editor-in-chief of one of the leading journals in our field, the Journal of Rural Studies. And it also says, well, you're co-editor of the Policy Press book series on civil society and social change. You still do that?
Yes.
Yeah, you still do that. Great. You have been elected as a Fellow of the Academy of Social Science in 2018 and Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales in 2017. You've also held visiting professorships at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, University of Ljubljana, and the University of Queensland. In 2014, you were awarded the prestigious European Research Council Advanced Grant, Global Rural, which looks at globalization and rural areas. and this ran from 2014 to 2019. You're currently, and it's nearing coming to an end, the Horizon 2020 project Imagine, which focuses on territorial inequalities and spatial justice. And we have the final event in May, if all goes well, in person or hybrid in Poland. Maybe also good to say a bit about the relation between you and the rural sociology group. I think our collaboration started, and there was Dirk was also involved in that, which was the DEREG project and FP7 program that you coordinated, which looked at Europe's rural region in the regions in the era of globalization. I think you focused on, don't remember exactly how many,
Something like that, yes.
7 regions across Europe. And more recently, you have also, you're still collaborating with Bettina Bock, who is a personal professor at our group, but also holds a special professorship at Groningen University. And through that, you're collaborating with her in the Imagine project. We have been working together for 5 years or 4.5 years in the Robust project, which looked at rural-urban relations. And Mike was mainly responsible also for developing the more conceptual and methodological framework of the project. The title of your presentation, Just Future for the Global Countryside, you told me, is a sort of attempt to actually link these different projects, your C project, Imagine, with a twist, slight flavor of Robust, sort of intermingled in there. So very curious to see what sort of that yields in terms of a presentation. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Just Future for the Global Countryside. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Han, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's always strange having your life read back to you. I feel like I'm on a game show or something. You've got to spot where the mistakes are. But thank you for the invitation to come here. Thank you, Mark. And it's an honour to be part of the 75th anniversary seminar series, but also something I'm very keen to do, because as Han has indicated, I've collaborated with various people in the rural sociology group, and indeed beyond that, Marketing, over the last 10 years or so. Work which is being done here is something which has been influential, again, on my thinking and my research as well. So I'm very pleased to be able to contribute to this series. And as Han indicated, what I hope to do today is to try to bring together some of the strands which have been there in my research over the last several years, to work on the global countryside and globalization in rural areas, to attempt through that to develop an assemblage approach to thinking about globalization, more recent work on spatial justice, particularly in the Imagine project, and that leading into, on one hand, emerging interests, and where I'm trying to take some of my research, but also a very old interest of my research, which goes back to my PhD, in rural politics, and particularly what I've called here disruptive politics, all circling around the idea of rural futures. So I want to think about the future, but I want to start by going back to the past, and inspired by the 75th anniversary of the Rural Sociology Group. I want to start by looking back 75 years. I'm not quite sure whether the actually group started 46 or 47, because obviously
46, we were actually supposed
probably
to celebrate last year.
Yes, I thought that after I wrote the slide, but 47 will do it. 75 years ago from this year. And where were we in rural Europe at the time? We were in the post-war recovery, obviously. All aspects of the rural economy, society, rural landscapes had been significantly blighted during the war, so we're about recovery. There's a period still of food shortages and food insecurity, a period of extensive rural poverty in many ways. But rural Europe was also on the cusp of massive technological and social change. Small-scale farming, which still predominated, was about to be replaced really by more industrial farming. There's prospects of substantial social upheaval to come, which were linked into a depopulation of rural areas. But it was also, I think, the peak of what I have called the nationalization of the countryside. And to explain this term, if we were to go back a further half century, back to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, at that time we were arguably in what has been described as the first wave of globalization. A form of globalisation obviously mediated in large part through colonialism, but also at that time the emergence of transnational corporations, both in agriculture and food supply, things like international harvester in terms of equipment, and the emergence of truly global production networks starting to come through. Part of the premise of that was more imports for food coming into countries in Europe, beginning to challenge farmers and landowners in Europe, adding to it a sense of rural transformation in much of the European countryside at the time, the response to which was often emigration. So we also had mass global movement and settlement in rural parts of North America, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and so on. So a quite extensive set of globalisations going on there. But that wave of globalisation started to be closed back down in the 20th century. And I've talked about how we get a nationalisation of the countryside through the early and mid parts of the 20th century, coming to its peak, I think, in this post-war era. And as part of that, we get national planning for farming and food production through those agricultural policies. We have it underpinned by farm subsidies, what Shingate has called the agricultural welfare state. That combined with protectionism and tariffs and quotas on agricultural imports. There's national regulation of land use planning introduced, national projects for infrastructure modernisation, public ownership often of key resource industries. It often also happened to be key rural landowners. And this nationalisation of countryside, I think, was premised on an idea of justice, developed from a social democratic or managed liberal perspective, which was aiming to achieve a modernisation of the economy and society, whilst also still maintaining a fair future for farmers and rural residents. And rural sociology as a discipline, I suppose, was heavily embedded in that project. It had that sense, I mean, going back to some of its origins in the United States, and the Country Life Project, it started in this respect. But certainly in Europe, rural sociology often was part of this national project, helping this transformation to take place. And I'm reminded also, for example, of no, I'm not, because his name is suddenly going to my head. Writing about sociology as often being framed within national context and calling for a move now to more global perspective. But sociology often has had a national framing, and rural sociology, I think, in particular. Of course, in Europe, after 1957, the Treaty of Rome, the Common Agricultural Policy, that nationalisation of the countryside gradually becomes a Europeanisation of the countryside. But I think it's notable that this kind of national countryside of the post-war era still, I think, has resonance of the benchmark against which subsequent globalisation impacts have been measured. And we have subsequently seen, of course, considerable wide-ranging globalisation impacting on rural areas. We get neoliberal policies beginning to introduce dismantling some of those welfare structures, opening up trade relations across the world, combined with liberalisation against migration, the impacts of technologies, and therefore what we at the end of the 20th century get is this emergent global countryside. As I developed this idea of the countryside 15 years or so ago, to some degree I was trying to challenge three myths which I think are prevalent in many popular ideas about globalisation in rural areas, but also actually in some scientific accounts. The first was a myth that globalisation is primarily an urban phenomenon, that the rooted, untouched countryside was an antidote to the global city, which is where we study globalisation. I think that myth has been largely discarded now. I think the evidence of the impacts of globalisation on rural areas are very extensive and very widely accepted. The second myth was that globalisation is producing a homogenised world, suppressing rural cultures, leaving everyone the same. The third myth that rural communities are the victims of globalisation, and there's nothing they can do about it. And I remember talking to an American agriculture economist who essentially said this to me when I said I was studying, globalisation in rural areas. It's such a pity. There's nothing they can do about it. Now, I'll come back to this third myth later in the talk, but to pick up the second one a bit more, I think one of the fundamental ideas of my conceptualization of global countryside is not that this is a new homogeneous space, but actually that the global countryside is a hybrid space. It's reduced by hybridization of the local and the global, and is uneven, is differentiated. That's something we started picking up as a Derrick project, which I mentioned, which I worked on with Jörg and others 10 years or so ago. And one of the things we did with this project as an outcome was this model of globalization impacts on locality. But it wasn't enough just to talk about globalized global processes. They also interacted with specific regional contexts and capacities to produce catalysts, which then led to the impacts of globalization. But that still wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't that a factory closed or the land was bought by international investors or new migrants moved into a rural area. It's also then how the locality responded, the policies, the grassroots initiatives which responded to that, informed by ideas of regional learning, which is what particularly the and Vika are working on, and producing what were then the regional responses and outcomes. And in subsequent work, I wanted to develop this further by thinking about, okay, we've got this broad model, but what's the mechanics underneath this, underneath the bonnet of this engine? Well, how precisely is this working? Why is it how precisely do this work so different outcomes come in different places? And that was the basis of the European Research Council project I had in Global Rural, running for about 5 years, 2014 to 2019, with a team of people based in Aberystwyth. And the luxury, the privilege of having a large ERC grant was the ability really to go global scale with this global project and to do research in all parts of the world and draw together well over 30 different case studies across a range of themes. What we tried to do through that project was develop a new analytical framework for thinking globalization, informed by ideas of assemblage thinking. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about best assemblage thinking today, and I'm not going to go into the conceptual, theoretical aspects of that particularly. I given a previous seminar here in Wageningen on that, but I just want to pull out some key points here which will feed into my subsequent argument. So the first point is to note that places in this framing are assemblages of human and non-human material and expressive components which are held together in a temporary and ever-changing configurations. And they're also interrelated, that places interact with a diverse multitude of translocal assemblages, in other words, assemblages which cross, transcend places, and which might be corporations, might be supply chains, might be transport routes, might be those technologies, might be social movements, and so on. And we argue that globalization is a product of the interactions between these place assemblages and these translocal assemblages. Not the only product, but is a product. If those interactions lead towards an intensification, acceleration, a multiplication of those cross place relationships, if they lead to larger assemblages emerging, if they lead to a production of a global consciousness, then that's what we call globalization. But they emerge out of these quite specific located interactions. The shifts in relations which are involved in that between place assemblages and translocal assemblages, and the reconfiguration of components within a place assemblage, alter the capacities of that place, that capacities of community. Its ability to do things, ability to generate wealth, to generate economic activity, to maintain landscapes, and so on. The capacities get changed by these relationships and transformation of them. But finally, for each of those interactions, each of those changes, there are many possible outcomes. Nothing is ever predetermined, predestined. There are many possible futures for a place, different forms of place language may take, dependent on the outcomes of these interactions. And it's that capacity for there to be many different possible futures, and the decision, the sense of which possible future prevails others will differ between different places, informed by all kinds of other factors which shape that interaction, which leads to this uneven global countryside. in which you're saying globalization processes may have different outcomes in different places. And what we argue is that an assemblage analysis can help to reveal the micro processes which lead to one possible future prevailing over another. So what's that doing is showing the mechanics. But step back from the mechanics and then say, well, how do we interpret that? How do we respond to that as communities, as individuals? And we start to evaluate it. So that unevenness gets interpreted by some as producing a global countryside of winners and losers. But that interpretation is dependent on value judgments. And this is where we bring in questions of justice. And we're used to thinking about justice in terms of some of the impacts of globalization in the global south, in less developed countries. And again, we saw examples of this in our research for global rural. So cases such as this, the eviction of an indigenous community from land in Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, which had been traditionally occupied by this indigenous group, but which has been overcoded and made into private land for international investors, attached to the corporate network of that international investor, attached to a global production network and assemblage, which are then producing a crop for global markets, and for which this group had to be excluded. There's no place for them within that new assemblage, so we have the indigenous group evicted, displaced from this land, and act clearly perhaps of injustice against this indigenous community. Or situate communities like this one in Malawi, which again have a differentiated, a partial integration into those global assemblages. At the one hand, receiving some of those consumer-led connections, consumer products coming into here, some of the technologies coming into here, some of the corporate networks coming into here, but at the same time being limited or constrained in their capacity to link into other global networks, which may help to generate wealth in these communities. And thus we still get endemic poverty alongside a partial interconnection into a partial forms of globalization. And our narrative, this narrative of injustices in the implication of globalization, the expression of globalization in some of these parts of the developing world, is one which has been nurtured and popularized through a counter-movement, a counter-assembly of the global justice movement. And that's an assemblage in its own right, which has come together in spaces such as the World Social Forum, here meeting in Salvador in 2018, and detachment, if you like, of particular places, particular communities, and the issues they face, broader global assemblage, enhances the capacities of those rural communities by enabling the stories of what's happening in them to travel, to create connections to international campaigners and NGOs, to try to put pressure on corporations and governments, international intergovernmental organisations, and so on, aggregating those individual cases into larger narratives and reinforcing a coding of these globalisation effects in these parts of the rural world as acts of injustice, as well as articulating alternative possible futures, which will be seen as more just. But one of the things which struck me attending this meeting in 2018 were the absences, because we had lots of participation here and examples here of communities, particularly from Latin America, to some degree from Africa, to a smaller degree from parts of Southern Asia, but hardly any participation from Europe, and virtually none from North America, from Australia, from New Zealand. And that's not to say that we don't have globalisation impact in those parts of the world, and that's not to say that there isn't injustice in those parts of the world. So what's absent from that justice assemblage is perhaps the other global countryside, another global countryside in which there are still feelings of injustice, of grievances, but which I find a different expression, an expression often through these forms of disruptive politics, I refer to them, populism, but not just populism. So research and analysis of that rise of disruptive political movements has frequently cited rural support for such movements as being attributed to communities being left behind by globalization. And again, we can come back and perhaps discuss whether that's how far that is an accurate or a fair reading in discussion and questions and answers. But that's certainly a fairly significant narrative in this literature, and that sense of being left behind by globalisation is important about economic marginalisation and distress in rural communities, about communities which have become detached from some of those global economic assemblages and networks. But it's also about things being introduced into those communities, about perceived threats to rural culture and identity, whether that's from migration, whether that's from a globalisation of values which have been imposed on rural societies. But those actions produce grievances in rural communities, but responses to those has not been to attach to a global justice movement, but rather to attach to populist political movements who exploit this sense of injustice. And partly they're able to do that by mobilising ideas of nostalgia, which then means that this kind of the framing of these arguments are looking back to that era of the nationalised countryside and the protections that maybe rural communities found there, that those protectionist trade policies restricting competition of imports, that there was subsidy for farming, that activities like mining were still active and providing employment, that there was relatively little immigration into rural areas and less competition of cultural change around that. Long-term cultures were still extant and had that long rootage. And that's often what's been looked back on in these kinds of response of these movements. And the fact of that retrospective gaze, the fact it's often going back to fairly conservative, socially conservative values, the fact that it's often fairly exclusive, reactionary, means that these kinds of responses can sit awkwardly with ideas of justice, or certainly social justice. I think this idea has been very well articulated in an article by Mike Carolan in Rural Sociology in 2020, where he starts by responding to the 2016 election in the United States. He argues that the 2016 election revealed certain gaps in the conceptual analytical toolkit of rural sociology and related fields. And I think you could argue this says certainly about Brexit in the UK and to some extent about the rise of populist parties in parts of Europe. And Mike goes on in this paper to link that support for Trump in this case to grievances in rural communities, but argues that those grievances are not adequately countered or accommodated by justice scholarship within sociology and elsewhere. He argues justice scholarship struggles to account for the non-metro grievances and account for the rural populism we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere. And asks the question, what becomes of those groups experiencing real grievances if their language does not align with what justice activists, scholars, and the activists themselves are looking for? And let's say concludes with by arguing that I'd like to see justice scholars reflect upon how they can better foreground rural grievances, including groups who might not fall within traditional understandings of marginal communities. So some of the things I'm trying to do now in my work is responding to this call. And I think one of the ways we can do that is to expand our scope, our vision of justice. Thinking not just about social justice, we have dominant ideas of racial justice, environmental justice, which is often framed here, but also thinking about spatial justice, which is where I think linking to a further project, the Imagine project, which I've been coordinating, including, as I had mentioned, working with Bettina and you're in her Groningen position. And the focus of this work has been about territorial inequality in Europe and whether it helps to apply social justice lens to thinking about those equalities and how they are tackled. And I'm not going to talk in detail about this project today, but I do want to take this idea of spatial justice out of that, because this is, to be honest, I haven't really worked with the idea of spatial justice for getting this project. So this project has been my route into that. And I'm kind of thinking actually the utility of this idea, which I can take back to my more established work in the rural context. I've here used a definition from the sister project of Imagine, funded under the same call, Relocal, which also has quite significant rural sociology input from those institutions. And therefore, a quite nice definition here of spatial justice incorporating social justice, focused on both the just geographic distribution of resources and opportunities, and on the power relation that causes injustice between social groups and between spaces. Intellectually, this idea of spatial justice has twin roots. On the one hand, in Henri Lefebvre's idea of the right to the city, and on the other hand, in the Marxist geography of David Harvey, and Harvey talks about territorial justice in terms of distribution of resources, and has been being developed by geographers such as Soldier and Mustafa Dishak, into what really has been a focus on urban social justice, urban spatial justice. So that's what's been mainly focused until very recently. What we started to see in the last few years is this idea being expanded, partly linking into regional scales, think about territorial inequalities in projects like Imagine the Local, but also people starting to think about, can we apply this in the rural? Can we talk about a rural spatial justice? And some work coming out of that from Mark Truxmith and others, out of the Local. And a set of work I contributed to as well in a fairly obscure article in an Austrian architecture magazine. And in this article, which no one can read, I tried to kind of elaborate a more multidimensional idea of what spatial justice is. And saying, yes, we can use spatial justice to talk about inequalities in the distribution of wealth and well-being between places, between territories. But it's more than that. It's also about the distribution of targeting of state resources and policies, including public service and economic policy. It's also about the distribution of power and decision making. It's also not just about things you can measure materially, it's about the perceived fairness of these processes and the operation of power within them, and the representation of territories and interests. Spatial justice from that then can be a catalyst for political mobilisation, expressing those grievances. It can also be a normative concept, spelling out what a fair distribution of territory across territory would look like. But the fact we can read this as multidimensional aspects of spatial justice also opens up the space that there's multiple forms of spatial justice aspects. One of the key conclusions I can imagine is that if we're asking the question, how do we make Europe more spatially fair, more spatially just, we're asking the wrong question, because there's no one objective understanding what spatial justice is. The question really should be, what kind of spatial justice do we want? Because there's different ways of interpreting this, whether we interpret the distribution of wealth and well-being, or we privilege the distribution of power and access to decision making. You end up different places. Which is where I think we can then start to try to combine these different aspects. Because if I go back to my assemblage analysis of globalisation, assemblage theory has been quite correctly, I think, critiqued as for being apolitical, or at least depoliticalised. Its contribution is really descriptive or ontological, not evolutive. And to be political, assemblage approaches need to be employed in conjunction with a more critical theoretical lens, such as that of spatial justice. Spatial justice, at the same time, involves evaluation of the outcomes of power relations. It helps to understand perceptions of power inequalities, but it then requires tools for identifying those practices and decisions which lead to those outcomes. And I think we can bring the two together, because I think assemblage analysis can help to reveal the processes producing spatial injustice. And the notion of possible futures within assemblage thinking can facilitate articulation and comparison of different ideas of what might be spatially just. In particular, there's an idea of an assemblage thinking of coding, which helps do this. So in this argument, assemblages are given meaning and identity by coding. That's any kind of representation or classification or regulation. And the argument is that these assemblages are more or less tightly coded, that they go through cycles of coding, decoding, recoding. In fact, they may overcode over assemblage to capture, so the state overcodes place on a globalization context. No new international standards, say conservation, overcode local practices. And coding itself can constrain the capacities of what happens in the assemblage. But coding, therefore, is an act of power, and it may be interpreted as being either just or unjust. But the coding entities and practices, right, constitutive of place, affect the capacity of those place assemblages, and again, may be interpreted as just or unjust, such as the example I've given of conservation regulations. But equally, when we start doing things like representing rural places left behind by globalization, that's an act of coding. It's coding those places, putting them into a certain classification box. And the articulation of social justice, injustice, are again acts of coding that provide a focus for the assembling of responses such as political movements or rural development projects. For the talk, I want to then talk through some of these ideas by revisiting some examples, some case studies from our global rural project. And I'm going to start in Canada, in the fishing outport of Kapasi on the southern shore of Newfoundland. And this is a community which is being constructed around fish. To use assemblage language, it's been territorialized around fish. Fishing is what gave it coherence, which made it a purpose, which held it together. But that capacity to be a fishing community depended upon connecting to another assemblage, the assemblage of the fishing industry, and through that to the actual act, if you like, of catching the fish themselves and bringing those into the place, assemblage of capacity where the fish can be processed and add value to the local economy. And engaging with this fishing assemblage meant competing with fishing crews at other places. And what were once the very affluent fishing bank fishing grounds off Newfoundland have always been a place in which there's been international competition, fished by crews from various countries around the North Atlantic. But the globalization of the fishing sector, the global fishing assemblage, in the late 20th century, brought in crews into this space, into these fishing grounds, from across the Atlantic and beyond, as far away as China, Japan, South Korea. And that led to overfishing, to the depletion of fishing stocks, which meant that the fish catches being landed back into Kapasi for the fish processing plant were increasingly depleted of the cod, which was really what they're trying to catch, the cod, which is a valuable species catching, less and less cod being landed. And that in turn had an impact upon the viability of that fish processing plant. To the point that in September 1991, the plant was closed as something which was no longer viable. A year later, the whole fishing ground was closed by the Canadian government. The Canadian government overcoded this assemblage. They closed down with a moratorium the North Atlantic cod fishery. And fishing from communities like Kapasi effectively ceased overnight. Part of the response was to put in development, state funding coming in to support the transition, to support intensive regeneration. But for many of the people who lived in Kapasi, the response to this change was simply to leave. And over a period of that's 25 years, isn't it? Not 15 years, 25 years. Kapasi lost 60% of its population. Now, we're applying assemblage analysis to this. What we see is actually this outcome was a consequence of a whole series of specific interactions between different assemblages, changes in the composition of those assemblages, at which there were possible futures, different possible futures. You know, the increase of pressure in the fishing ground, what might have been sustained, but it might have been that the fish stocks were completely exhausted, or that it came to just the liver depleted catches, the state intervened. At first it was liver depleted catches, that led to reduction in the number of cod in the catch coming into fish processing plant. Well, again, it might have switched to other species, it might have been subsidised as loss making, it might have been sold as a going concern to another company, but the decision was to close the plant. It might have been bought by another company and reopened, but it wasn't, it remained closed, partly because the moratorium, the state intervened and closing down the fishing ground had happened. This took the major employer out of the local place assemblage. No, that might have led to that employer being replaced by other employers. It might have led to the community becoming a dormitory settlement. It might have led to people living and staying in town but with high unemployment. Or, as it happened, it might have led to depopulation. And then there's a consequence of that, of what happens then to that town. So this helps thinking through, how did we end up with this future we have? For most of those junctures, the critical decisions were made outside Kapasi, and the capacity of the community to make a difference has been constrained. Those were kind of consequences of changes made in other translocal assemblages. And as such, a party could easily be represented as a victim. Certainly there's a sense of spatial justice initially against the Canadian government's closure of those fishing sites as being abandoned in coastal communities, and frustration later on at the limited achievement of the government-adjusted programmes and the possible futures they envisage. But criticalisation led to the community organising itself to articulate its own vision for the future and assembling the necessary components. So it brought together workshops and focus groups. It started thinking about what did it want the community to look like. It started thinking about what would be the key components of this future capacity. Identified a critical point here, a necessary point, which was to buy back ownership of the site of the fishing plant, which is now in the ownership of an Italian company. The community bought it back, they redeveloped it, they attracted a Norwegian company to invest, they generated income, which then helped to maintain other community facilities, and develop broader tourism and cultural activities, the way diversified the town, such that it now became a fairly unlikely, attractive retirement destination. So here, to some degree, spatial justice has been achieved in the end by the town taking back more control of its destiny. My second example is Batland in Queensland in Australia. And Batland was a small town, again, which was initially built around a single industry, a small coal mine which initially operated to provide coal for a railway, which transported farm produce and timber. That coal mine closed in 1980. Batland then continued really as a farming town with little other real economic opportunities around it. But in the early 2000s, mining was resumed in order to provide coal for export to China. Mined this time not underground but through open cast mining. And we planned that open cast mining would be extended such that it eventually entirely encircled the town. Opponents of this plan started to campaign and try to enrol the judicial system in a counter-assemblage by making an appeal to the Australian Environment Code. And that case was based upon a coding of the environmental impact of mining, particularly air pollution and its impact on the residents of the town. So through that case, they presented the mining development as an environmental and spatial injustice against the residents of this town. But in the meantime, the mining company started buying housing in the town. And one day in 2011, they moved in and took all the houses away, quite literally in the back of the truck. Batland today is a ghost town. The roads are there, telegraph wires, street signs, but no houses. Or rather one house. There's one resident who's still there. The media, he gets referred to in some activists and someone has been the last man standing. And I went and interviewed him, and we sat in his garden with parakeets flying around and butterflies, this lovely tranquility of this abandoned town. And I asked him why he had refused to sell. And he said, I haven't refused to sell, I just haven't made my mind up yet. So, indecision can be an act of heroism at times. But what this does show, there is only one house left. But interestingly, there are other buildings there. The old school is still there. The old village hall, the old post office, the old telegraph office, the playground in the park, all of those are still there. And that really indicates that those houses were not removed because they were in the way of mining. They were removed to prevent anyone moving back in. They were done to close down the possible future that the code might have thrown out the mining plans and the residents might have moved back into the town. It was removing that possibility. And of course, also nullifying the argument that mining was damaging because of air pollution to residents. There are no residents involved. That argument is irrelevant. But what's happened from this in assemblage terminology is that Batland has passed a critical threshold. Mostly assemblages are shapeshifters. They adjust, they change their format, their constitution, but they maintain some kind of central identity which endures. In this case, Batland has flipped over a threshold where there's been a qualitative change. It's no longer a town. It's no longer a community. It's still a place, but no longer a town, no longer a community. And maybe that's the ultimate spatial justice. The enforced eradication of a town surely is an act of spatial injustice. Yet the Components of this place assembly at Batland also include these. Signs saying, I support the new Batland mine. Because within this wider locality, there is plenty of support for the mining project. And that support comes from imagining a different possible future without mining. And it's based upon a perception that this is a forgotten rural area with marginal farming, limited alternative employment. It's a region which has expressed grievances in the past, which has supported disruptive political movements, the right-wing One Nation Party in the 1990s and populist independence more recently. And mining, from this perspective, was seen as bringing jobs back to the region, providing a way out for struggling farmers who wanted to sell up and leave, of subsidising and supporting community activities. And that blocking the mine, stopping mining, would have been an act of spatial injustice, sacrificing the future of this community for the sake of some broader environmental ideals. So what Batland really reveals, again, is that there's different ways of interpreting spatial justice, and there's different ways of constructing these possible futures. That comes also into my third and final example. The community of Dom Perito, down in southern Brazil, right at the border with Uruguay. And this is the Pampas, this is traditionally ranching country, Gaucho country of the South American cowboys, for cattle, but especially for sheep, which were the mainstay, wool was the mainstay of the local economy in the 1970s, when changes in global wealth assemblage from competition with synthetic finances, from aggressive posturing by Australian wool growers, squeezed up, reduced the incomes coming in from wool sales, and transformed the economy of this community in Brazil. The large estates were subdivided, they were sublet to new tenant farmers, primarily of German and Italian extraction, who moved into the area from from northern parts of Rio Grande do Sul, and brought with them arable farming, particularly rice in the first instance, and then increasingly soybean. And indeed, over the last decade, soy cultivation in this region has boomed and taken off, and is now by far the most significant land use in this region, driven by global demand for soybean, and particularly demands from China. That growth of soy has contributed to increasing prosperity as measured by GDP for the time, which has significantly gone up. It's seen investment in the growth of agribusiness and seed companies and various agricultural services, as well as investment in other services such as a Walmart supermarket community. But at the same time, it's also contributed to increased inequalities within the community of Perito itself. There's different labour demands from soy farming than there were particularly from cattle or sheep farming. And that means less labour required on farms, but also the soy is simply harvested, put in trucks, taken to the port at Rio Grande and exported to China where it's processed. There's no processing locally. Whilst the decline in meat production means that the meat processing plant at the time was closed down. The consequence of that is higher unemployment. There's local population change, reduced need for farm workers and reached patterns of those, people moving in from the rural hinterland into the town itself, which has led to the closure of rural services and schools, which has been particularly controversial. Part of this particular squeezing out of the local peasant smallholders, the Pecuarista familiar, as they call them, whose smallholders are not only squeezed by demand for land and the perennial loss of supporting services in schools out in the rural hinterland, but also by the transgressive impacts of soybean cultivation, and particularly the use of pesticides and herbicides, many of which are not licensed for use in Europe, being applied through aerial spraying, which of course doesn't stay in the soybean land, but transgresses and floats across into other land, and has effectively wiped out vegetable cultivation in this region, has effectively killed out beekeeping, has been polluting watercourses, and which is accused of contributing to high instances of cancer in the town. For campaigners such as George here, this raises some questions of social and environmental justice within Don Pedrito. But the farmers themselves have their own grievances, because the position of soy and rice farmers in the global agri-food assemblages is also precarious. They are indebted to transnational agribusiness companies as part of the business model of following. They're vulnerable to trade fluctuations and competition. At the time we did the research, I was particularly concerned about being undercut in Brazilian markets by cheaper imported rice from Paraguay. And they're exposed to environmental conditions like drought, and concerned about the effects of tighter environmental regulations, so the pressures to ban those agrotaxios, as they call them, the agrochemicals being applied. That gets vented for a sense of frustration at the perceived inaction of national government at protecting their industry, which gets then seen as a sense of spatial injustice and neglect of communities such as that of Don Pedrito. And this got expressed, articulated through a meeting of farmers we went to with Jeronimo Gorgon, who's member of the Brazilian Parliament, sometimes referred to as the member for agribusiness. And in this meeting, we heard these grievances coming out, and we heard a repeated refrain: Trump is right. Trump has got it right. And that's partly referring to Trump's approach to protectionism of the American steel industry, and wanted similar protections here in Brazil. But 6 months after this, Don Pedrito, like many rural communities in the south, centre and west of Brazil, voted for Jair Bolsonaro in the presidential elections. Jeronimo Gorgon here was himself a critical figure in building the coalition behind Bolsonaro. He was tipped to become Bolsonaro's agriculture minister. It didn't actually happen, but he became a kind of prominent advocate of Bolsonaro from the back benches in the international media. So we see someone like Don Pedrito. Again, we can use an assemblage analysis to think through what are the variables here, what are the interactions between the place assemblage of Don Pedrito and global assemblages. What might change? What are the possible futures associated with that? What are the potential impacts of that? But what then are also questions of justice? Questions of social justice arise and how these possible futures are managed. How far does the national government act to protect the interests of Don Pedrito from these impacts? But also how are inequalities and impacts within the locality considered and addressed? How do we think about justice in that context with these quite different social groups in the community? And therefore I want to close this talk by saying, well, that being some examples of, from our previous casework, of looking back and applying that spatial justice lens on top of the assemblage analysis we're doing. So the last 5 minutes I want to look ahead to the future and to come back here to my own territory of Wales. And to do this, to draw upon work we've done as part of the Robust project, which many of you in the room are familiar with Han and others. And as part of Robust, we're working in a living lab in Wales with the Welsh Local Government Association, and our main focus was on producing a rural vision for rural Wales. So this led us into thinking about the future. And we had workshops and focus groups, both online and in person, talking to people about what were their visions, what were their hopes, their fears about the future of rural Wales, what they think would matter. Now, it's striking that actually many of the possible futures imagined from a positive point of view, the normative ideas they're coming up with, what they wanted the vision to look like, were actually fairly modest and unadventurous. They often really seem to be, we want it to at least continue how it is now, not get any worse, or we wanted to go back to something like it was before. The fears, though, were the ones which were imagining a transformation. And they're often fears about changes coming in from the outside. And very often, globalization doesn't really get mentioned as a concept or a term, but much of the concerns were about these interactions with other global assemblages. Impact about changing trade relations. The effect of Brexit, on the one hand, cutting some of those relations, links with market assemblages in Europe, potentially what happened then to the capacities of the farming community in Wales, but also fears about trade deals between Britain and New Zealand and Australia, and the way in which they would introduce new imports which would compete against Welsh produced food. The potential that there might be an overcoding of having to change agricultural and environmental regulations in the UK to liberalise them as part of these trade deals. This seen represented as a perfect ball, a perfect storm for Welsh agriculture. Concerns too about things like tourism. When we're doing this work in 2020, against the background not only of the COVID pandemic, but a very short and intense tourism season, which led to all kinds of over-tourism in parts of rural Wales, issues about trespass and littering and illegal camping and so on, which is then positioned against awareness of spatial injustice in a sense of limited public services and infrastructure in these regions. Linking to also in terms of concerns about the growth of Airbnb properties or second homes, taking housing out of the assemblage for local people and having that impact there. Concerns too around projects around rewilding, represented by some as forms of colonialism. Again, changing the code, overcoding this land, changing the assemblage around it. And more recently, the last few months, the big issue now in Wales is the buying up of farmland by corporate investors from outside Wales in order to plant trees as part of carbon offsetting projects. And this is now a critical question at the moment. So all of these are actually about interactions between place assemblages in rural Wales and these translocal assemblages, and how they start to overcode what is there, and how they change the composition of these place assemblages, and how they therefore change its capacities, what it might do. And all of these are really, I think, being seen as acts of spatial injustice. And that's being framed often through a nationalist perspective, which in Wales is generally a left-leaning progressive nationalism rather than right-wing populist nationalism, but still nonetheless sees this as us against them, as this threat from the outside. Wales is not for sale. If you read like this copy of Treverian, this is remember Treverian, this refers to a valley in North Wales which flooded to create a reservoir and supply water to Liverpool, which is a critical moment in the Welsh nationalist movement. At the same time, there's also an epidemic of discourse of rural Wales being exposed to these outside influences and threats because of long-term economic distress and long-term neglect by the UK and Welsh governments. And that's reinforced by a rhetoric of spatial injustice directed at urban-based decisioners in Wales and in the UK who are seen as distant and not interested in the problems of rural Wales. One of the interviews we did for Robust articulating that virtual mentality of people who are largely urban-centric in their outlook and don't really know what reality actually is. And that critique also applies for new regional development schemes being constructed now in Wales, which are being constructed around city region models, creating new governance assemblages which are jamming up urban and rural areas, but it's part about the recoding of those rural areas. And disputing the fact that often this is recoding those rural areas as the appendages of cities, the appendages of urban economies, and perceptions that rural interests are being marginalised within them. Again, if this quote from one of the Robust interviews gets across, saying, I'm not coming again to do address once more as the hinterland. I know, because we're not a hinterland, but that's the way the city saw us. So, to bring this to a conclusion, what does this, my question then, going forward in research, well, how can that future rural Wales be negotiated and those questions of spatial justice addressed? And I think we can look back to some of that assemblage analysis to help us to understand how those threats may change place in rural Wales. But applying that allows us to consider both the material roles different things play in rural Wales, but also the most subtle, symbolic, expressive roles of different things in the assemblage of rural Wales. It allows us to look at possible futures, what those options are, and evaluate those for a level of social justice, and identify the critical points at which transformative change happens, and they need to be targeted to achieve that most spatially just outcomes. The one quick example of that is dealing on the Welsh hill farm. And the hill farm now, to be honest, plays a fairly minor material role in the economy of rural Wales. Provides little income, provides little employment. It does have a continuing material role in the reproduction of landscape. And it has a very significant expressive role as an icon of Welsh identity, and particularly of rural Welsh identity, and an iconic significance of the Welsh language in particular. It's threatened, though, by these interactions, by trade deals, which may remove that health farm from connections with other markets, whether that's through competition for domestic markets or linking to international markets. It's threatened by potential overcoding through rewilding projects who want to see who see this farmland as a problem, want to return it back to a more natural state, or overcoding by forestation projects who see this as prime land for planting trees to actually consume carbon and offset emissions elsewhere. And that switch from an agricultural assemblage to these other assemblages will materially change this land. All of these changes would change the capacity of a hill farm to enact the material and expressive roles it's seen as playing in the assemblage of rural Wales. And these possible futures are out there being discussed and coded in terms of acts of special justice or injustice. So if those changes are seen as injustices against the place of rural Wales, what possible alternative futures are there? Is it about creating local food assemblages, creating emphasising premium food? Is it perhaps about seeing farming as a cultural public good, about some kind of managed plan of adjusting, reducing the extent of farming? Assemblage and answer, I think, also then help us see if those are the possible futures are more desirable. How might they be achieved? Where are the pinch points? Is it about regulation of land use? Is it about subsidising farming? Is it about building new alternative assemblages to knock up? But also potentially what are the knock-on effects in an interrelated global countryside? Now, if we don't plant trees for carbon offsetting in rural Wales, if we don't use that land for renewable energy, what are the impacts of potential injustice against other places in the world who may suffer more the consequences of climate change and so on? So, to conclude from this, what we try to do is to pull together the global countrysides, a place of flux, interrelationality, multiplicity, a front line, I think, in future debates around the post-carbon transition and so on. And these involve transformation in rural places through interaction with translocal assemblages, which will be interpreted through lenses of spatial justice, potentially fueling media discontent. But nothing is predestined in this. And we need to think about ways of envisaging other possible futures, to understanding where the critical points are which lead to those possible futures. And that's something I think an assemblage analysis combined with spatial justice can help us to achieve.
Mike, thanks very much for, I think, a very comprehensive, also thought-provoking seminar. Just looking at Mark, are there also questions in the chat? But we can start here with people that may have questions. First over here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting. And I was wondering, how do you ensure you don't stay blind to other forms of injustice when you're looking at contexts where they may be more influential?
I think it's a very good question. I think, and it's because I think that, I mean, that is one of the things about the case that Padrito was saying. There are the farmers were there feeling that there was injustice against the place, but actually there's clear injustices within the place. And what the farmers wanted to maintain was having its own injustices within the place against workers, and particularly against Indigenous peoples and people of colour in that community. I think you can build that in. I think that that again, I think if you're using this analytical approach, you can ask that similar question of who benefits, who doesn't, what's the impact of this in different groups, how they can be considered in this, and we can be alert to those kind of injustices as well. But I think there's, so I don't think spatial justice becomes used at the expense of thinking about what's other kinds of injustices. And actually, so I mean, some of the work around this has talked about the intersectionality of thinking about spatial justice and social justice together. It's another layer, I think, we put against that, but it's not something I think to be used in as an alternative. But what it does, I think, is then highlight some of those contradictions. So we go back to thinking about the rise of populism, intermittent rural grievances of communities feel they're left behind by globalisation, or feel their culture is threatened by the social change associated with migration, for example. That's a real grievance there. And I think the argument of Caroline knows they've been excluded perhaps from traditional ideas of justice. we need to recognise that, but we also need to recognise that often that it's framed in an exclusionary way against maybe people from different backgrounds within that community. So there's a maybe privilege in that creates other kinds of injustices, which where I come back to, I think it's not as simple as saying, well, there's some kind of inherent justice out there we need to achieve. It's recognising that these kinds of justices are complex. They can be contradictory. And the challenge, I think, is partly to get in the analytical framework here to allow us to understand how do those interact and how do we get to a place where one gets privileged over the other. And then there's another set of issues to debate about how do we manage the situation when they come into conflict. And there's a whole set of ideas I'm interested in, which I haven't talked about today, which then gets into ideas of how we promote dialogue and how we actually then perhaps try to tackle polarisation within communities. That's a whole other different research project.
Yeah, thank you.
Ron?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate it. Also, the way you brought in your own critique about assemblage, and then I think that's always the best way of doing it, right?
Yes.
To make sure you incorporate it, respond to it.
People have said enough to me already. I had other questions like this.
But still, I would still like to push you a little bit on that.
Yeah.
Because one thing, when I sort of think about my own research in rural areas, that I think sort of, challenges some of the assemblage thinking is sort of a little bit of the harder political economic forms of power that sort of are situated in the background of some of these kind of struggles, right? I mean, you referred to that, but for example, I didn't really hear you talk so much about property relations.
Yes.
And the history of property relations and how they become etched in particular spaces and enable, but more often, right, disable particular sort of historical trajectories towards more spatial justice, right, and rights that back them up. And right, I mean, power structures are also very big power structures, very good at sort of cementing all of their claims into property rights and those kind of things, right? And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a challenge. And I think my answer to it, as I kind of maybe try to preempt in the presentation, is to say that isn't what assemblage thinking is trying to do, and we shouldn't try to understand it in that way. But assemblage theory isn't. I try to avoid using the term assemblage theory. Partly it's not. I don't see it as a theory, and one of the reasons I don't see it as a theory is I don't think it has an explanatory role. It is an ontology. It's a way of viewing what's there. It's a way of describing. It leads to methodological approaches of analysing it. I think it then needs to be, if you want to be uncritical about it, it needs to be applied with other concepts which are more critical and more theoretical in that way. And I've used special justice here, but linking into political economy ideas about property rights and justice, I think would be another way of doing this, an equally valid way of doing it. I think how you translate that, you marry that to the assemblage approach, would then say, well, those property rights are a form of coding. So within the assemblage terminology, that what this is doing is it is coding those that property in certain ways. So the slide I showed of the indigenous community being evicted. What's happening here, and people like Nancy Peluso has talked about this more in that context in Brazil, that you have land which actually still hasn't been codified in that way previously. And what's partly allowing that land now to be attached into these global assemblages is a new act of enclosure, which is a nationalization, which is overcoding that land with property rights, and which then has no space for these to come through. So there's a form of coding then was property rights. But you're right, that then there's a kind of these things accrete power over time. And both of those become restrictions are embedded in the structures, the territorialization of those assemblages. And again, those become part of the expressive roles of those components, that they play certain symbolic roles. So, I mean, so to the idea, Welsh Hill Farm, the idea of a family farm remaining in family ownership is an expressive role that farm plays. It's representing an idea, an ideal, and that again shapes the capacities of what can be done. And that's partly why there's the sale of a farm becomes controversial. And it's, materially, its role can be still the same. It's different expressive associations linked to it. So I think we can carry across those kind of ideas. But so one of the challenges I think in assemblage thinking, and it's there in some of the writing, is at the one hand it says everything is ephemeral. It's always changing, constantly changing. Yet these assemblages endure. If we're tied to places, places are constantly changing, but those place identities and the social structures of them have an endurance and endure. And that's, I think property ownership is one of the things that should endure, and those places endure, those property structures change over time. I think you can link that to assemblage in terms of thinking, okay, how would you understand those relations from the assemblage period? But the assemblage itself doesn't explain why they're there, it doesn't explain why they have that duration. And it's a political economy, I think, that help to provide that explanation. It's not, it's I think it's that is this I think is one of the challenging points there. I think there is something there. I think it's it's an ongoing thing. I keep trying to struggle and thinking through this because I think there are these questions. How do these things fit in? And I think there are ways of joining it, but it's I haven't fully come up with the final way of doing that.
Kira. Yeah, contrary to Bram, I am a big fan of assemblage. Hey, let me out. Say I was not a fan. You need to start your question. No, but in a sense, it is, and you're not to blame for this. It's a very academic exercise.
Yes.
And yeah, the question is a bit, like, is it so interesting, or will it be so interesting to do only, let's say, academic exercises in the future, writing evidence reports? What does it change, really? And I think reflecting on a lifelong, erratic kind of trajectory through all sorts of rural areas, there's so many interesting things going on. There, and the question is, how do we engage with what is going on? How does things like assemblage theory, perhaps help re-territorialize the assemblages that we critique, for instance. So I would like to have your thoughts on that. And also, I think you're optimistic. I'm an optimist too, but also reflecting on a lifelong erratic trajectory in rural areas. I must say that these many possible futures, I mean, people were saying this in the 50s, 60s too, but to be honest, just a few of them materialize. And the ones that materialize are not very rosy.
Yes.
In Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Spain.
Yeah, no, and I'll take that last point first. I think you're absolutely right. That's the whole point. There's many possible. There are many possible futures. Only one materialises at any one time. It's closing down to that. So why that one? And I think you're right. Lots of places that is not particularly positive in the future, and we can envision some of these other ones, but. It's difficult. I mean, I think I said in this one that alternative possible futures for local hill farm. There's lots of people talk about local food assemblages. Actually, it's very difficult. There's a problem that won't work because there's not enough demand for the lamb meat being produced by these sheep farms locally. That's not the answer to this problem. Premium foods. Well, again, everyone's trying to put premium value onto their foods. Farms are cultural good, but then you've got to justify that in public expenditure terms. So each of these might be kind of like, there's a possibility here, but it's, I think you're right, they're difficult, a lot of these are challenging. Now, I think what I want to move away from is a fatalism of saying, there's nothing which can be done. It is all going bad. There are those places, who do construct some of their own a more positive outcome. Not everyone can do that, of course not. But I think it's responding to fatalism, and it's then looking around and saying, these are difficult, but how do you actually negotiate the best possible outcome from this? How do you actually achieve something which might be slightly better than the very bleak fortunes which are there? And can that be done locally, or is that about things which are happening. It's all about the function of transnational corporations and national governments and trade. And I think that's where assemblage theory can help to work back through, what are the structures that are leading to these outcomes? Breaking it down to those micro processes. Why is that change happening? Why does this, what might be the possible change future outcomes? And why is it that this possible future is the one which actually comes through and carries through? So that's, I think, where the value of assemblage thinking can be. The challenge I need to say is so that's utility, which gets beyond an academic exercise. But then we need to be able to communicate that and apply that in ways which are helpful. So again, assemblage thinking, language and terminology is not friendly to academics, let alone to non-academics. So I think there's some sense of how to translate. So I think that's, and I think there's this kind of thing I'm thinking here today. It is about saying, well, let's leave some of that language behind and push through what does that mean in terms of looking at this in practice and maybe focus on one or two terms which maybe you can grasp. And talking about this in embedded ways through particular projects where we can say, well, this is where we can show of there's political mobilisation around kind of different ideas. Lots of energy being expended trying to change things which were not going to be changed. Projects which are not going to materialise because they're targeted in the wrong way, because they won't work. So can we use assemblage to think through that? Can we use assemblage to try to get people to focus on things which may be more achievable, to work at what is possible?
Just talking.
Yeah, sure.
So very short one.
Yeah.
Articulating with non-academic languages is interesting. It's important also. But what would you say about things that are being said in these languages about not so much interspecies justice, social justice, spatial justice, but interspecies justice?
Yes. Again, and I think that's in. And again, one of the potential assemblage approaches, in fact, it takes that agnostic approach to the human and non-human. And yes, I think that's the third extension of this. I've not sort of touched upon interspecies justice here, but it comes in there. And I'm just to say one example of that. I think that does, in the global countryside, that is another dimension of globalization effectively real, where we have got, for example, a universalization of values around things like animal rights. And that then gets overcoded, to use the language of assemblage theory, in terms of traditional practices, whether that's traditional farming practices, whether that's the hunting in various communities, and so on. And then that raises questions of spatial justice at that level. To what extent do you value the continuation of a traditional culture? And you may view that very differently. We're talking about an indigenous culture somewhere as opposed to a rural culture somewhere in Europe. What is the difference? So there are questions of spatial justice coming about that. And then there are these questions of interspecies justice. If everything is agnostic, if each has the same value in these assemblages, well, why not afford the same rights to those non-human components as the human components? And then the politics are. So again, it's what assemblage theory doesn't do is give you a value judgment on what's right and wrong about that. That's why you need to deal with theoretical insights. But it perhaps allows you to work through what's the consequence of doing that, or to understand how it's being implemented at the moment through the coding exercises and the effects of those coding on the capacities of individual assemblages or components in those assemblages, on the relations which gets built.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for this fascinating introduction into spatial justice. I didn't know the concept so much, and I was not sure whether I was really capable to understand some of the, let's say, the definition of spatial justice. And I was in particular thinking about the response of Amartya Sen to John Rawls, if I understand it well. John Rawls more about the principle of justice. When you have a discussion about normative ideas, you come to an agreement about the basic legal institutions to guarantee social justice. Amartya Sen is more a consequentialist, so you focus on the outcomes. If I interpret your talk, you're more sort of focused on the outcomes when you're talking about spatial justice.
I think that's where, yes, and I think that is
the way social justice has tended to be developed and applied in literature, I think, is more inclined towards a setting position and personal consequences. Certainly, I think the existing work on spatial justice, and urban spatial justice, particularly in geography and sociology, is really concerned more with consequences rather than sets of rights of individuals. And some of the work which has been extending back, for example, into rural spatial justice, is particularly concerned about ideas of capacities and the capacities of communities, which are both, again, I think linked more to ideas of capabilities and the sense approach rather than a roles-in approach to justice. I think it does tend to lie on that side of the equation. I think you go back to kind of some roles in ideas around justice. Space, I think, to some degree comes in here in terms of thinking about the community entitlement, and that's where spatial justice also comes in. About do we is the community entitlement a nation state, and within that you have to compromise some of the rights of individual communities or the impacts of communities. When you let me give you an example of which comes from Imagine, which is not rural work necessarily at all, but in Imagine, we've been thinking about spatial justice and territorial inequality in Europe, and we've been doing some scenario work of how this might be developed in different scenarios. And one of the key tensions we've drawn out there is between solidarity and autonomy. And so you think of spatial justice, for example, in terms of an equitable distribution of wealth or resources between regions in Europe, you need solidarity, and you need Europe to construct as a community of entitlement and a sense of European identity as a precondition for accepting solidarity and distributing it. And the cost of that is that the ability of individual regions or countries to set their own rules and differences gets overridden. What we get in things like the Brexit movement and those separatist movements is a claim for spatial justice, which is about the distribution of power, and which says actually this is spatial injustice. We want to hold on to more of the money we generate, our wealth, we don't want to share it. We want more decisions brought back home to make our own decisions. So that's the autonomy pole of this. But if you do that, you aren't able to achieve an equitable distribution of resources at a European scale. You're closing down the community of entitlement down to those smaller regional scales. So that's where the tensions set up between different visions of spatial justice. And I think you can use some of the roles in ideas to think through the consequences of that.
Great. Mark, are there any questions online? We're also getting very close to the end of the session, which was scheduled until 1:30. So I think I can say a couple of closing words, and then, well, let me. I think we're going to move towards the camera now.
Oh, you're still looking at me.
Still looking at you, yeah. No, but I first of all want to thank you very much for coming over to Wageningen to give this talk. I think it was a nice one, a good one, really fitting in well in our series on the seminar series, looking back and looking ahead on rural sociology. And also sort of nice to see how you are sort of also trying to connect some of the projects that you have been working on. I was sort of curious to see when the robust work was coming in, but it featured very prominently. I think it would also be really interesting to sort of hear what sort of your follow-up thoughts are in terms of sort of taking stock of all of this and building on that. But I think that would be difficult to answer really shortly at this moment. Maybe nice to discuss later on today and see if there are also possibilities for new collaborations in the future. So I want to thank also people here in the room for attending and engaging in the discussion with Mike. People at home, also thanks for or at home or at your offices or anywhere you are watching online. It would also be on YouTube soon, so even people not attending the live stream today can watch it later on. And with that, I would like to close the session, and we have the last seminar series on which day? I forgot the date, or don't we have a date yet?
Sometime in May.
Sometime in May. very close to our event on the 13th of May, and that will be Sally Shortall, who will be speaking there, which will be the last speaker in our seminar series. So hope to see you there in person, online. Till then, bye-bye.